Okay, so here's the million-dollar question. What actually is the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics? Now, when you first heard these terms, you more than likely scratched your head a little. I mean, they have the same prefix of micro and macro, right? What's not to get? Well, fear not. In this video, we'll take a closer look at these two areas of economics. This guide should be especially helpful if you want to know the differences between microeconomics and macroeconomics, their similarities, and how they relate to one another. The most important thing to keep in mind with the economy is that it's not actually an economy, but a macroeconomy, one made of groups of smaller microeconomies. Yes, this means you can be an expert at microeconomics, but still be clueless about how macroeconomics affects you and your investments. So, let's get into it. An explanation of the differences between microeconomics and macroeconomics. The two primary subfields that make up economics are called microeconomics and macroeconomics. The choices that individuals and corporations make are at the center of microeconomics as well as macroeconomics research interests. In spite of their seeming differences, these two branches of economics are closely tied to one another and can both benefit from the other. There are many difficulties that are shared by multiple fields and can be found in each of them. Important details that ought to be remembered. In economics, the study of microeconomics concentrates on the choices made by individuals and enterprises, whereas macroeconomics looks at the choices made by nations and their governments. In microeconomics, the emphasis is placed not only on supply and demand but also on other factors that have an effect on price levels. The study of macroeconomics takes a top-down approach and attempts to forecast the nature and direction of the economy in the future. Microeconomics is a useful tool for investors to utilize when making decisions, whereas macroeconomics is utilized to guide the direction of economic and fiscal policy. Microeconomics. When it comes to defining how resources should be allocated, microeconomics looks at how people and organizations arrive at their pricing decisions in order to determine how resources should be distributed. It takes into consideration governmental regulations in the form of taxes, restrictions, and other forms of regulation. The study of supply and demand, in addition to a number of other aspects of the economy, is known as microeconomics. It examines the economy from the most fundamental level on up. That is to say, the purpose of microeconomics is to gain a deeper comprehension of the decision-making process that people go through and how they distribute resources in the real world. As a result of the fact that microeconomics does not make any attempt to analyze or explain the forces that ought to be at work in a market, one cannot make this assertion about it. Instead, it discusses the outcomes that result from particular circumstances being altered. On the other side, microeconomics investigates how a company might maximize its production and capacity in order to lower its prices and compete more effectively in the market. The financial statements of a company can provide a lot of information on the company's microeconomic environment. In the field of microeconomics, there are a variety of fundamental concepts, some of which include, but are not limited to, the following. Together, the principles of the law of supply and demand and the concept of equilibrium are what determine prices. In a market in which there is perfect competition, the price that suppliers demand is identical to the price that customers are willing to pay. As a direct consequence of this, economic equilibrium is accomplished. Production theory is an academic field that examines how various goods and services are created or produced in the manufacturing process. The cost of the resources that were used to manufacture a good or service is said to be the primary factor that determines the price of that good or service, according to this hypothesis. At its core, labor economics is concerned with the investigation of wage structures, employment rates, and income from the point of view of both employees and employers. Before one can claim to have a firm grasp of microeconomics, they need to be familiar with the principles and theorems that form its foundation. Macroeconomics. In addition to analyzing the economy as a whole and the regulations that govern it, the study of macroeconomics focuses on how the acts of a nation's government influence its population. This method is known as a top-down approach since it focuses on entire economies and industries rather than individuals or individual businesses. The problems, what should inflation be, and what drives economic growth, are two examples of those that will hopefully be solved by this. The study of large-scale economic phenomena such as gross domestic product and how fluctuations in unemployment, national income, growth rates, and price levels affect GDP is the domain of macroeconomics, which is a subfield of economics. The field of macroeconomics investigates how fluctuations in a nation's capital account and gross domestic product, as well as how the unemployment rate influences both of these variables. Because macroeconomics places an emphasis on aggregates and the statistical linkages between them, governments and the agencies that they oversee use it to construct economic and fiscal policy. Those who invest in interest rate-sensitive assets need to keep a careful eye on the United States government's monetary and fiscal policies. Many people regard John Maynard Keynes to be the founder of modern macroeconomics due to the fact that he was the first person to use data on monetary aggregates in order to explore broad economic phenomena. His opinions have been called into question by a number of economists, and many Keynesians are divided as to the most accurate way to understand his work. The debate between microeconomics and macroeconomics, as well as investors. Although microeconomics might be useful for individual investors, macroeconomics is something that just can't be ignored. When it comes to conducting research on the economy, technical investors may think differently from value investors and fundamental investors. Although portfolios as a whole are more likely to be influenced by microeconomics, individual investments are nonetheless susceptible to the repercussions of macroeconomic trends. Warren Buffett has stated in the past that macroeconomic projections do not have a role in the decisions that are made regarding investments. When questioned about the process that he and his partner Charlie Munger used to select assets, Warren Buffett responded, "Charlie and I don't pay credence to macro projections. We've been working together for the past 54 years, and I can't think of a single time when we discussed macro when we were evaluating a company or a stock." Even Warren Buffett has been known to refer to publications in the field of macroeconomics as the funny papers. John Templeton, a well-known value investor, has been quoted as having said things along the same lines. "Whether the market is going up or down, I never inquire because I don't know. And moreover, it does not matter," Templeton stated in an interview with Forbes in 1978. "I never inquire because I don't know, and furthermore, it does not matter. I hunt for equities in countries all over the world to see if I can discover one that has the lowest price relative to what I believe the stock to be worth." It is possible for macroeconomic circumstances to influence the performance of an investment portfolio. Yes, the macroeconomic environment can have a substantial impact on the performance of your investment portfolio. The Great Recession of 28,209 was brought on by the bursting of the housing bubble in the United States and the near collapse of financial institutions that were significantly involved in the issuance of subprime mortgages in the United States. Another illustration of how macro variables affect investment portfolios is provided by the response of governments and central banks to the crisis that was caused by the pandemic that occurred in the spring of 2020. As a result of governments and central banks throughout the world injecting money into their economies through fiscal and monetary stimulus programs, share markets all over the world saw record highs in the latter half of the year and during the first half of the next year. How does one visualize a macro strategy for the entire world? When it comes to investing and trading, a global macro strategy places a primary emphasis on the occurrence of macroeconomic events. The term global macro refers to the field of research that investigates and studies many macroeconomic concerns, including but not limited to interest rates, currency levels, political shifts, and country relations. There are two distinct areas of study in economics: microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics focuses on the decisions that are made at the individual and organizational level about the allocation of limited resources. Macroeconomics is the branch of economics that looks at how a whole nation's economy works. What kind of connection exists between supply and demand and the fluctuating prices of the stock market? The concepts of supply and demand, which are central to microeconomics, exert both an indirect and a direct influence on stock prices. The influence of demand and supply mismatches is a good indicator of the immediate impact on stock prices, which may be assessed. When there are more buyers than sellers of a certain stock, the price of that stock will go up because demand will be higher than supply. On the other hand, when supply is higher than demand, the price of that stock will go down because there will be more sellers than buyers. The supply and demand for the underlying company's goods and services is what determines the extent of the indirect influence. If the demand for the company's products is so high that they are quickly being removed from shop shelves, investors might predict an increase in the price of the company's stock. However, if there is a lack of demand for the company's products and there is an excess supply on the market, it is likely that the company's profits would decrease and its stock price will go down. It is possible that my portfolio's performance is a result of both microeconomic and macroeconomic factors. It is a fact that the microeconomic and macroeconomic conditions of the world have an effect on the performance of your investment portfolio. It is essential to have a solid understanding of the effects that supply and demand, taxes and regulations, and macroeconomic factors like growth and gross domestic product, inflation, and interest rates have on various parts of the economy as well as your investment portfolio. At the end of the day, there is some overlap between microeconomics and macroeconomics, but what matters is knowing the differences and how they'll affect your investing strategy. Now that we've reached the conclusion of this article, I hope you are better informed about what exactly is going on in the world at large and why it might affect you. Better understanding can often lead to better decision making, so make sure to keep up with changes related to these two economic sectors. Were you aware of the differences between microeconomics and macroeconomics? Do you have any additional information that others should know about this topic? Let us know in the comments section below or join the conversation on Twitter. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content to transform into smart money.